I am very, very glad to be here, and I have been struck by all of the comments and the discussion that's been happening so far. And if I could indulge you and say, have 2 minutes of reaction to that, that would be great. First, to those who are here from the Guns in America, I don't do social media or keep up with the media that much, largely because there's so much about what I do is written about, and it's harder for me to actually do my job objectively if I'm exposed to all the stuff in the media. But for that group, I haven't ever seen anything written about the way gun language has infiltrated the American vernacular, and the way that bullets, somebody mentioned a magic bullet up here, but you've got triggers for behavior and targets and bullet points and faster than a speeding bullet and shooting for the stars, and our language is just filled with references to guns. And I think about that as a psychiatrist, because I think the language that we use and the way we write about things can unconsciously sort of drive the way we feel about certain topics. And also was really struck about the comment that journalism is about relationship building. And that's exactly what psychiatry is about, totally. Actually the relationship building in journalism is probably quite private also. But that's the core of psychiatry, is to build a relationship. And then I think another very important similarity is that we're both storytellers. I think psychiatrists at their core are essentially storytellers, not generally of their own story, although I think in the spirit of self-disclosure, that's probably a good thing to do, but helping patients find their own story and understand their lives and create a narrative that makes sense, and that may or may not need treatment. But to put one's life into a narrative that you can understand is enormously therapeutic. And so I do think a good psychiatrist is able to do that with their patients. So Steve did a little bit of introduction about my work. Just so you know, I do work for New York City, and so unlike some of the other speakers and panelists, I do not have the same kind of freedom to talk up here about everything, and that I hate that. I hate the restriction that puts on, because I do think that the way to improve the conversation, and by that I don't just mean getting to a political point, but to just have people talk openly about things, is for large agencies that run the criminal justice, the health systems, the judicial systems, to have them be more transparent and more open about what happens. And I know that certainly the agencies I work for are gun shy about that, and I'll explain to you a little bit about why down the road, but you should know that I do work for New York City. And have thought at various points, including this summer when I took a leave of absence for really awful burnout, that maybe I wanted to get out of the city work so that I could talk more freely about things. But I think at my core, I do fundamentally believe that to change things in a durable and lasting way, you got to work from within. So I'm willing to sort of take that, manage that balance for the time being. I don't think of myself as an author. I mean, although I did write a book, I guess maybe that. But I am struggling to find the way to best communicate, not just what I think about the criminal justice and mental health interface, but to try to represent the voices of those who are incarcerated. Those are not voices that get heard, certainly not first person very frequently, and these are not mass incarceration, the criminalization of people with mental illness. That is not an issue that has yet affected the people who are really in power in this country. It has not really directly affected them in the same way that Parkinson's disease affected Michael J. Fox, or AIDS affected Magic Johnson, or illnesses directly affected very important cultural figures in our society, and that drove a lot of change. And that hasn't happened to the same degree. Or if it has happened, those in power haven't chosen to use their voice to help in the effort. And I think that's a challenge that we're facing in terms of talking about this topic, and getting people to buy into it. So the reason that I didn't end up writing the book was selfish in some ways, because I had struggled for a decade working at Bellevue as a psychiatrist on the unit there for men who were incarcerated in the jail and needed to be in the hospital. So they were all dangerous, because you can't get into the hospital without that, and they were all seriously mentally ill, so largely schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And so that's the group of patients that I am the most comfortable treating. It is a very tiny percentage of people with mental illness, and has sometimes, I think, like skewed my understanding of how people with mental illness behave. But in any case, that's my preferred patient population. And I spent like 10 years trying to convince people that it was a decent job, that it was something that one with a good education and good training and some professional respect would actually choose to do. And I failed at that. And at the time when the offer to write the book came out, I was just at the point where I thought I'd had enough experience to be able to opine about things in some kind of way that might help. And I also was given the freedom to write about what I wanted and the way I wanted to write it. Just a footnote there, that is one of the biggest challenges you'll face getting access to people in government or in institutions, is that they want control about what you're going to produce in terms of the story. But I was given that flexibility, and honestly, the other reason is that I was suffering from PTSD at the time, both primary and secondary, and I was watching all of the staff on that unit burn out and experience vicarious trauma, and I needed to stop. I mean, I needed to stop the work, and I needed to find my own narrative that would help explain to me, like, why would I subject myself, my husband, my 2 delicious children to, like, the impact of this kind of work on me? And so I thought writing a book would actually help that. And in fact, it did. It helped a lot, which is good. Then that was, I think that was primary, I don't know. Unconsciously, consciously it wasn't even there at the time that I was thinking about it. The conscious motivation, which certainly is still there, is to try to portray the very complicated world that these individuals, not just the patients, but the staff, operate in a way that was not riddled with statistics. Nobody looks at statistics. Statistics do not change people's behavior. At least in my experience, that's never been the case. It's like personal interactions. It's, like I've never met, if I meet some of you in person and shake your hand, I'm going to have a connection with you, but just looking at you as an audience, less of a connection. And I think the same thing is true with all those numbers and stats. It just doesn't change behavior. So I was trying to just be honest and transparent, and to allow the reader insight into that world, most importantly, the humanity of those patients who I adore. And I'm not supposed to say that as a psychiatrist, but really I feel deep love for this patient population. And to just get people curious about it. I probably not in this room, but I think nationally, and I've been able, as a function of the book, to speak in states that I would say where the political, the overriding political beliefs are not in line with my own. But even in those places, there is this, there's this shared communication understanding about just talking to another human being. Like, everybody gets that. And if you can get the audience past why someone is in the jail, or whether they believe that marijuana should be legal or not, or whether they're pro-gun, or all of those things, when you talk about what happens when you have an important interpersonal interaction with someone, like, all the other stuff sort of disappears. And it's been a wonderful experience for me to see people with whom I disagree strongly, and who will tell me to my face, you're feeding addicts if you're giving them methadone in the jail, or all these people should be locked up and they're all crazy. Like, even with those kinds of discussions, there's some shared conversation that we can have, and I think that's been very important, and was a goal of the book, certainly. I don't know if I accomplished all of those goals, to be honest. And I wrote it in 2014 and 15-ish, and since then have moved on to the larger jail system. And so I've been at Rikers Island for almost 5 years now, and that experience has really opened my eyes enormously to the many more layers of complexity that are involved in this system. I thought that I understood it when I was at Bellevue, and I maybe understood like 10% of it. I think maybe now I'm up to 20%. I don't know, but it's been very eye-opening, and I think there are some important things that I've learned about that, specifically when it comes to communication. And by the way, I'm still, like, this is all, even including coming to speak here, this is all an effort on my part to try to figure out how to talk about this. I don't really know the answer. I want to be super respectful of those patients. I want to be protective of them. I want to be protective of the staff. I want to be honest. I tend to talk about myself. I want to be transparent about all those things. And I want stuff to change. I want to message something that will, even if it inspires only one person, move the system. Because I work in a system that frankly sucks. There's another word to describe it. And I want it to get better. So I'm going to tell you a couple of things that have shifted for me in my perspective. The first is that I came into this field. Well, first of all, I started thinking I was going to be an expert witness on the stand and at all the fancy trials and opine about people who are not guilty by reason of insanity. But it turns out, for me personally, that's not particularly fulfilling. And I took care of my first patient in the jail unit at Bellevue, and there was this instant connection. I was being a neutral psychiatrist the way I'd been trained, and he was like, dude, cut the bullshit, come on. And sorry, can I say that?
Yeah.
Okay. No, but the patient was teaching me. He's like, look, and we had a conversation. I don't know how long it lasted, but at the end of the conversation, it was clear to me that he was lying about something. And him being so honest with me allowed me to ask him, is that really true? I can't remember exact words, but something about sort of confronting him, not in an accusatory way, but just hey, man, we're just two people talking. Is that really true that you want to kill this is what it is. You want to kill yourself? He's like, nah. I just want to get into the hospital because jail sucks. Which is, of course, understandable. And if you hear that phrase and as a psychiatrist think, oh, you're going right back to jail. You just lied to me. That is not a reason to get into the hospital. Forget it. That is going to have a different impact on that patient than spending 10 minutes extra with them to be like, oh, okay, that totally makes sense. I don't know if I can get you into the hospital, but is there any way that I can call the jail or figure out something else? And just 10 minutes of not discounting a person can be really impactful. Anyways, that experience really stuck with me, and then 20 years later, I'm still doing the work. That's not a thing that I've learned necessarily. So here's that: there are no clean right and wrong answers in the work that at least I've been exposed to. So it's very hard to make any kind of clinical decision that may not have some kind of negative downstream effect. You have security pressures all the time. This isn't a lecture about Rikers, but I don't work for the Department of Correction. The Health and Hospitals, Correctional Health Services is independent, thankfully, from the security agency. And so we can, in theory, do what we think is in the best interest of the patients. But the patients are all in a custodial jail setting. And so there's this navigation around healthcare decisions that may or may not impact security. And nothing ever feels... that's probably not true. It's very rare that any decision feels good. I just did what is best for that patient. The work often involves finding whatever is least worst in the situation. So you're choosing from a lot of bad options and what is going to be the least harmful to the patient. So an example of that, and also the way that, because this relates to the example as well, but the way that policy decisions are made in these systems, and how a very well-meaning idea and plan can be executed, and there's another sort of potential gun reference, but in a way that won't end up with the intended consequence. So an example in the system in New York City is getting rid of solitary confinement for people with serious mental illness. Great idea. Fabulous. I'm not in favor of any kind of, well, frankly, I'm not really in favor of jails or prisons, to be honest, but certainly not in favor of solitary confinement. And that's a great idea. And this happened prior to, this was in 2013, and I wasn't in the jail system proper yet, but it's a great idea. The decision was made on X day, and then the following day, Nobody with serious mental illness was in solitary confinement. But what was happening to them? Right? So there were a lot of people who had been locked in for 23 hours a day for months, and sometimes years, who, if they didn't have serious mental illness prior to going in, had developed some kind, now whether it was mental illness or not, I'm not sure, but certainly had developed behaviors and sort of ideas and thoughts that could be very harmful. And they were no longer in the setting where they were. And the violence rates were huge. The patients were victimized. The clinical staff and the DOC staff were really struggling to try to figure out how to take care of these patients who got into solitary because of violence, right? So it was a very complicated thing. It sort of rings bells for me of deinstitutionalization and a great idea of not institutionalizing all these patients, but there's got to be an alternative somewhere. So now, where are we? 6 years later from this decision, the jail has figured out how to do this, and that's fabulous. But the impact to those patients who were sort of caught in the roughly year struggle of how to take care of individuals who were very violent and seriously mentally ill, and for whom the hospital would not admit what to do in that jail setting. And another downstream effect of getting rid of the solitary confinement for those with mental illness is that the mental health staff at Rikers Island is mandated to assess everybody who's been seen by our service to see if they're cleared to go into solitary confinement. So I hope that perks your ears up, ooh, that is a bad decision to have to make. It is terrible. I don't know of any person that I would say is okay to go into that kind of situation, and yet, and it's sort of, that's one of the big pushes that I've been working on since I've been there and have been unsuccessful. But we're tasked with figuring out who can go in and who can't. And my preference would certainly be that instead of making that decision, which is security, we make the decision to take people out of solitary confinement. So whatever happens within, a few hours of them going in, we're surveilling them and coming out. But instead, the mental health service now has the reputation of the people who put people in solitary confinement. And that is a downstream effect that really affects the staff in terms of that particular policy decision. Other things that have shifted for me. Jail is not all bad. Which it's hard for me to even say that. I think that there are some redemptive possibilities and rehabilitative possibilities in an environment where everyone is there. Now, of course, they're forcibly there, but people are there. You have access to a community with which you can do good things. I really do believe. It's not exactly happening right now, but the idea that everybody who works in a jail and that every jail is awful is the idea that I had a decade ago, and that has shifted pretty significantly. I have become much more familiar with the officer staff and the reasons that the Department of Correctional Officers go into this work, and it is very rarely because they just want to hurt people or punish people. I've actually never, I'm not sure anyone would tell me that that's the reason they went into the work, but mostly it's because, look, I want to help people be safe. A lot of the officers are want to be social workers. And then what happens, though, is the system shifts. It just transforms people, much as it does people who are incarcerated. And it changes. And if you're stuck in that system without some kind of sort of spill valve to get rid of all that stuff you pick up in these toxic areas, then you can kind of morph into somebody who may or may not be that helpful to the individuals there. So I've changed in that opinion. There's an anecdote I'll tell you. It relates to animals. But it shows, I think, the two sides of the jail that exist that don't really get reported on that well, I don't think. So my office is in one of the jails. It's called West Facility, and my window looks out on a couple of layers of barbed wire. And then the first month or two of my time there, a seagull got caught in the barbed wire. And I saw that happen and immediately ran out. The wire, and it was not as tall as that window, but close. And I knew that if I climbed up, well, first of all, this is a dumb thing to do, but I thought, I'm going to climb up and save the seagull, but then I'm going to get like shot by the I mean, something's going to happen badly if I climb up this barbed wire, but the seagull is like, up there, stuck. So I go to the bubble officer, the guy at the front. I'm like, I'm crying. There's a seagull up there. You gotta. Okay, we'll call animal control. Don't worry. This was a Friday afternoon. I was like, okay, great. And I go back and I sit, and I can't look at it anymore because it's too awful. And I just go back, and on my way out, okay, you'll call them, right? You call? Yeah, we call. We left a message, and then I come back on Monday, and the seagull is dead. And then for the next several months, I watched the seagull decay over the barbed wire. I know, and I, as I was watching, I was just thinking, is this the place where I'm coming to work? Where things are just neglected, like where crises are ignored and things are neglected and they decay and like living things just die here. And that's actually not what my experience has been, which is good. And shortly thereafter, I saw, this was in this fall, what was this? Spring, fall. There's a family of ducks that lives on, that I don't know, they don't live on the island, but they must swim around the island. And I was waiting in traffic, and traffic had stopped on the one road in the jail because the Department of Correction van that had been transporting some of the incarcerated individuals who do labor in some of the other jails had stopped, and the officers and the inmates who were in that van had jumped out because this mother duck was walking her little baby ducklings across the road, and they wanted to make sure that those ducks all got safely across the road. And then I thought, oh, is this the kind of place I'm working in? Where like everybody is supportive and we want everyone to grow and thrive, and that's what the place is like. It is extreme on both ends, and I think hard to convey that. I find it very hard to convey that in a way that I just find it hard to convey. I guess that's what I'll say. I'll keep stopping there. I've also learned that psychiatry, as I was trained, is not the end-all, be-all in terms of taking care of patients with criminal justice histories. It's certainly not the thing that people think about the most when they come out of the jail. I was taught if you could just get someone to their mental health appointment once they get out of jail, all will be well. They'll never get arrested again. They will have family support. They'll have a place to live, et cetera. And in fact, none of that happens. And I've increasingly, but I feel like I'm much more of an advocate for social interventions than I am for the particular right medication for a patient. I believe strongly in the housing first model. And I think that, New York City is striving, I think still struggling, to figure out how to really manage the situation. Okay, and then I have also conceptualized the criminal justice system in general as the identified patient in this whole problem. So we talk a lot, and I talk a lot about patient pathology, the impact of incarceration on patients, but I think more and more about the whole system as the patient, right? And how one manages a neglectful or abusive patient. And the analogy is a child who's acting out in school and who maybe is beating up other kids. And that kid becomes a problem kid, and all the attention goes on the kid. But what's really happening at home is that the parent is neglecting the child or abusing the child. And so really it's the parent, right? If the parent and that dynamic gets resolved, chances are good that the child's behavior will improve. It's the same thing in the criminal justice system. If we can get the parent agencies to be transparent and to be thoughtful about their challenges, and if we can get news outlets to stop with the finger pointing and the blaming all the time, then I think maybe we got 5 minutes left, and I'll keep going. But it's the similar concept. And so I think if there's more discussion that can be had about how the system in and of itself is in some ways pathological, and maybe psychiatrists can use and psychologists and social workers and therapists can use expertise about human behavior and how individuals interact, and transplant that onto how systems interact with each other and impact. We may have a different story that that might ring true for folks. And I've also learned that I cannot give a soundbite. Although I heard a few really good ones up here on this panel, I like the scar and the wound one. That was really, it's so true. I very personally, it was not, I was attacked for the first time in my career a year and a half ago by a patient that I've taken care of for a decade, and it was extraordinarily traumatic, but I've only just been able to talk about it. And I couldn't certainly at the time then, but anyway, so sound bites are tough in this, and I can appreciate that sound bites are what people want to hear, and you need that like fancy, sexy tagline. I personally, and there are probably others who are much better able to do it, but I personally really struggle with it, because the more you get into the system and the more you understand how complex it is, the harder it is to have a very clear black and white answer to something. So I get a question like, shouldn't we keep everyone with serious mental illness out of the jail? I'm like, I want to say yes, except like not everyone with serious mental illness is incapacitated and can't make decisions for themselves, and what would we do, and who would decide that? It's too complicated. Or like, what's the cause of mass incarceration? I get that a lot. I'm like, well, it's like an essay, and sometimes, honestly, it's gotten to the point for me where people are like, hey, how's it going? And I can't even answer that. I'm like, well, so it's hard, and that I can appreciate absolutely that's not really helpful for people who are trying to report. I will say that I know I got to stop, but an approach that can be helpful, certainly for inside the institutions, is to hopefully try to instill interest in stories that are hopeful about change that's going on. The impact of it's mostly the Post and the News, but sometimes it's the Times. The impact of the stories that are written about the jail system in New York City on the staff who take care of the patient are significant. And it reduces staff morale. It's very hard to recruit people into the jail. It is, without a counter argument about why this might be a place where we can drive change, all everyone has is the negative reporting. And there's stuff that is worth reporting. We have had one suicide in that jail in 3 years, which is astounding. Suicide's the leading cause of death in jail. And we have our rates are some of the lowest in the country. We have identified that 3% of the people who come into the jail, 3% may not seem huge to you, but it's about 90 people a month, have intellectual disability. They're coming into the jail and they are developmentally delayed or don't have the wherewithal to figure out what's going on. 3%. And until then, nothing was happening for the patients. Now we have structured housing areas where these patients are actually getting out of jail faster because we're able to support them and keep them stable. And so that, frankly, they're not acting out of fear and becoming violent and picking up new charges. I came into the jail thinking we really have to force medicate everybody. That's kind of how I was trained at Bellevue. These people are so dangerous and they're so sick. And I have done a total 180. There is no need to force medication on people. If you develop a relationship and give people time and have some tolerance obviously there's a limit to the tolerance, but for tolerance for behavior, patients want to get better. They want to do the right thing even in the jail. And I think I'll stop there because I'm getting a look. Anyways, so thank you very much, and I don't know if I've left time for questions.
Please line up for questions. The first question I wanted to ask is something you and I have talked about. There's been so much coverage in the last year or two discovering criminal mental health, that in fact it's sort of the solution to everything. And I do think one of the things that we always have to keep in mind in what you do is that you're at the jails, not the prisons. So these are all
That's
people
correct.
who have not been convicted yet and are not in prison. So there's separate prison issues. But I'm curious what you can tell us as journalists and as also as mental health professionals who write about criminal justice, sort of where to place it, because I think it's gone from zero to the most important, if not reason, then metaphor, but I'm not sure that all of us who are writing about it necessarily know that much more about it than we did before we weren't paying enough attention to it. And I do wonder if it's being both minimized and maximized at the same time. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about, keeping in mind also for people who have to write about this.
Yeah, I know I'm trying, and I'm sorry. So I think both are happening, the minimization. Well, I don't know what you mean by minimizing and maximizing, but as you're talking, I'm thinking, I think there are really great pieces about individuals, specific individuals, and their particular individual path through the system. And then I think there are articles that do a good job of describing the huge, giant problem. And there's not a great, I haven't read a whole lot of great stuff that's in the middle there that incorporates both the individual human piece and the policy, what's driving the stuff that is impacting that person. How to do that, I don't know exactly. You do have to get access, I think. You have to get access to people on the inside who will talk to you about some of those things. And increasingly, I will say New York City is becoming a little more transparent about that. Just being able to talk here today is an example of that. But I do think that if there's more, nobody expects to have control over the article that's released, but if there is less fear that the only thing that the article will do is highlight who's to blame rather than present it as a very complicated situation and it's very hard to find a right answer in there, then I think there's going to be a little bit more uptick. It's hard to do. I mean, I've spoken to a few of you guys in the room, and you know that I'm like, I can't say that. We could do off the record. I can't direct you to patients because I'm absolutely never going to reveal who a patient of mine is. So it's challenging. I don't have an answer for you. I'm sorry. That's why I'm at this conference, to find the answer.
Hi, I'm Catherine Hormetz. I'm a psychotherapist and organizational psychologist. And I work 2 days a week in a very low-income clinic where access to mental health is so limited. And it takes me 5 to 7 weeks to get some of my patients in to see a psychiatrist at clinics like Bellevue. So I'm thinking that criminal justice, mental health in the criminal justice system is the symptom of the misgivings of society of not graduating enough psychiatrists, not having access, and so forth. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the sort of, the things that lead people to eventually wind up in a system like yours, and how we can prevent that.
People meaning psychiatrists working in the system, or people meaning incarcerated in the system? Because we got problems both ways.
Yeah.
Is it both?
I guess both.
It's both. I don't, so the second one's a little easier. I don't think, or maybe not, but I don't think psychiatry as an organization has done as much as it can do to, frankly, destigmatize for psychiatrists doing the work in jails and prisons and honoring the complexity of what goes on there. I don't think psychiatry residencies do a good job at all of training people about how to talk to individuals who've had criminal justice history. So we're really well schooled in how to talk about sex and money and other uncomfortable things, but not about criminal justice. And so when patients bring up that they just got out of jail, the eyes glaze over and the conversation quickly moves to something that the therapist may feel more comfortable with. And that's not doing a good service to the patient. So I think training is an important piece. You asked the mass incarceration question, I think, like how did we end up here? And it's very complicated. I was not alive for many of the policy decisions that were made in the 60s and 70s around that I think that led to this stuff. But in general, I would say that the social stressors of particularly urban living really affect people with mental illness and substance use in a significant way, and that particularly also in urban settings we can have much lower tolerance for behaviors that may appear weird or scary but aren't actually that dangerous. And so I think we struggle with that here.
Hi, I'm a neurologist actually at Sinai. And
hello.
I just had a question about kind of how so it sounds like you have been pretty thoughtful about working within a system that has these issues that are probably not going to get resolved in a huge way. I mean, unfortunately, it's these minute changes. Yep. And I feel like in neurology it's sort of similar. And I mean, your institution has a much lower suicide rate than mine does, actually. So, it's things like that where I just wonder, and I mean, I love my field, and I think it's going to be incredible in the next 30 years, the things that we'll be able to do for people. But it is the prospect of these minute changes where you go to work every day and you just feel kind of ground down. And I just wonder how you've kind of addressed that for yourself. And I know these are kind of personal questions, so I hope it's not too
No,
much
personal
to ask,
questions are way easier to answer, so I'm happy to do that. But it's a very important point, because this work is not, I think it's the work of multiple lifetimes, so you're sort of signing on to something that you hope will continue over generations. And that's not particularly satisfying in the day-to-day, and can, I think, if you think about it too much, lead to some serious burnout. The way I manage that is by seeing patients, because even patients who are yelling at me or upset, there's something very valuable to me as a doctor to just feel like I'm having an interaction with a patient. And the vast majority of times, as long as I'm respectful and actually listening, I may not have any great advice, but if I'm just listening and looking them in the eye and calling them Mr. Smith rather than by the book and case number, I feel like that's doing something. And so I focus on the really tiny and try to, somewhere in the ether is the very big, but that gets overwhelming.
I wrote down my question because I was afraid I would botch it. But so I'm a freelance journalist, and I'm in the middle of a really long form piece, and I mean really long form piece, about a person with mental illness and substance use disorder who has cycled in and out of incarceration settings for his entire adult life. Oh, his entire adult life, sorry. Did you hear that
I
thus
did,
far?
yes.
And I'm wondering if you have some advice for me about how to make that piece the most effective story it can be.
Is it someone in this area? Can you answer that? I
In
don't know.
Philadelphia.
Oh, so in a city. Do you have a point to it?
Well, I'm searching for my
Sorry.
point. Yeah. He's been in and out of incarceration since I've been in contact with him. And right now he's in a treatment setting
And
as part of a forensic intensive recovery program, court-mandated program to put him into treatment rather than incarceration. So part of the story is about my relationship with him.
Oh, great, because that was going to be my first
So
point.
because I'm really
Right.
struggling with that,
Yeah.
and actually that probably should be my question. I'm struggling with a lot of what Sarah talked about, boundaries, and I want to solve his problems, and I know I can't. He'll ask me for money, things like that. But he also is incredibly grateful to me for even paying attention to him. So I don't know. Any advice, any little tips you can offer would be wonderful. I don't care what they are, just anything.
Well, you might care what this is, because I
Yeah.
think probably most of you won't want to do this. But your comment about your relationship with him,
Yes.
your feelings about, I think what is lacking in the discussion, and frankly, I'm not a journalist, so I don't know if this goes against the ethics of journalism, but I think some of the best ways to describe the way, if the message you want to convey is something around how people feel about those who are incarcerated or the systems or something, I think it's helpful to inject how you feel into the piece. How did it feel to sit with someone who has been in jail all the time and maybe you never have? Or were you ever scared? Were there times when the person really surprised you? Like you asked a particular question, you, from your research, knew that we're pretty sure what the answer would be. And then they said something that was really tugged at your heartstrings, or you thought, oh, wait a second, that's similar to my experience. Or there's something about that, again, keep going back to it, but the human connection, and that I can appreciate maybe. I'm just imagining maybe that taints the journalistic style in some kind of way because you're not being fully objective. But honestly, like the way you feel about something is the way you feel. Nobody can argue with that. And the way people feel about the interface of mental illness and criminal justice is what drives policies. It is not the statistics, it's not the reality, it's the way people feel. So if you can't get to that in the article, I don't know. Is that helpful?
Very.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you.
Whew. I mean, I believe it, so that's good.
Hi, my name is Peter. I'm a fellow in the public psychiatry program here at Columbia. I
Excellent.
think you're coming to
I
speak
am.
to us,
Yep,
which
I'll see you
I'm
soon.
excited about. I was also, I studied journalism in my undergraduate degree. And so I really appreciate what you've said. Part of the reason I left the field for a while was this kind of feeling of, always pointing out the negative or what's going wrong. And so you seem to be responding to that and wishing for a little bit more. So I'll just put a little plug out there. There's a organization called Solutions Journalism. Maybe the journalists in the room know about it. And they do online trainings for how to target your stories toward the solutions, just to, add to the discourse in the world about what can we do. And I think that that's really important. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a student here at Columbia. So for my master's project, I am doing a profile of a transgender woman in a men's prison and the kind of challenges that she faced. And so I just got off a interview this morning, and she was telling me that if she didn't get her sex reassignment surgery soon, she wants to kill herself. So I was just wondering, how do you respond to these kind of things?
Well, first off, I would just, maybe we can talk afterwards so that, and you can maybe tell me where the prison is, and we can, it's just important to take anything like that very serious. Now it's important to take that seriously, so I don't want to just leave it dangling. Maybe we can touch base about the details later. I think if you don't have access to somebody who may be able to relay the message into the jail or prison and to the health staff there, then I would encourage, this relates to what do you do when you hear bad stuff and you're not sure how to help. Every prison and every jail has it's called an inmate grievance council, and they have a sick call protocol, and they've got, in New York City it's 311, but in every jurisdiction has a general city number that people who are incarcerated can call. And I would encourage that person to make this known to the people around them. And if they don't want to, then you're a little bit stuck. You can always call anonymously to the to the correctional institution and say, I heard this and I'm concerned about the person. Again, no good deed goes unpunished, because sometimes when you report things like that, it ends up that the person doesn't get exactly the kind of care that you wanted. But specifically, let's see if we can help sort of after this. Okay, I'm gonna go.
Wait,
No, I'm not gonna go.
Before you clap and before you go, I have one other question. So one of the things that we've talked to journalists about in covering mental health is getting more access to records and getting it so that we're not just taking a patient or a family member's word that they know everything about their own care, they remember everything about their own care. It's a challenging thing, but it's something that I think is really, if not the gold standard of journalism now, it needs to be pretty soon. So while you're here, I would be curious, since this woman's doing a piece on somebody who has complaints about the system, is there any transparent records when someone's in jail or in prison that a journalist can see to cross-reference when somebody's telling them in an interview about how they're being treated or what treatment they've gotten, whether it's medical or otherwise?
No. Not without the patient's consent.
No, of course the patient would consent. If the patient, if the patient consents, can we as journalists ask them to request their own prison or jail medical records so that we can do a deeper dive into what they're talking to us about?
No. But this is like a show here. But the patient can request them, and then once the patient has the medical records, they can do whatever they want with them.
Okay. Excellent. That's great. Thank you very much to Dr. Ford.